Nigel Bevan and talking about planning user-centered design.
If it doesn't work. Okay, if I can have my slides. Good, let's see if I can work the clicker. No, I'll try this one. Yeah, that one works. Okay, so I'm very pleased to be here today. It's a great opportunity, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak to people from this region. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. Okay, so the things I want to cover today are really practical things. My background is I started out as a researcher at the National Physical Laboratory in the UK. Then the laboratory got taken over and run by a private company, and they turned us into consultants. But that suited me because it struck me the biggest challenge we've got is not more methods for how to do better usability or better user experience. The problem is to help industry to take it up, and that seems to be a major challenge. I've worked with a lot of organizations, and really it's a bit of a mystery to them what they should do and why they should do it. And that's another reason I've got involved in international standards to try to promulgate good practice. So what I want to talk about today is why user-centered design is important, how you can use usability and user-centered techniques to mitigate risks people have when they use systems. And I think that's I think everybody involved in this area should be very aware of the contribution they can make to reducing risk. And then how one goes about selecting methods for user-centered design and a framework I've developed which can help one do that. I'm going to talk about several international standards today. I've worked on a lot. In particular, I want to talk about what usability is all about. There's an old standard I originally worked on, published in 1998, and we're just revising that now and trying to understand how to promote and explain a broader concept of usability than we had back in the 1990s. There's also a very important standard which defines good practice in human-centered design, and that's the 18529 standard. Again, that's being revised at the moment to try and represent state-of-the-art in best techniques and processes one should use when designing. In addition to that, the key standard in this area is 9241 Part 210. For anybody familiar with these, it replaces the old 13407 standard, now renamed into the series of standards to do with user interfaces, the ISO 9241 series. So when looking for justifying the value of doing user-centered design, I looked at what we wrote in this 9241-210 standard, and there were a lot of very wise people sitting around there, and I think they came up with many very compelling reasons. Benefits that one can offer. Producing systems which are easier to understand and use, to improve the user experience, increase the productivity of users, reduce training and support costs, increase accessibility, reduce potential discomfort and stress from using bad systems, provide a competitive advantage to a company in the marketplace by having systems with higher usability, and to reduce the risk of failing to meet the key stakeholder requirements when you're developing a system by paying attention to users and other stakeholders. So those, I think, is a good overview of the rationale. And looking at that, these objectives go a little bit wider than usability. And in the past, we used to promote user-centered design to improve usability, but in fact, I think one's now aware that there are a number of associated issues which are equally important and closely related to usability. Usability is defined by ISO in this very broad way as the extent to which a system can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. This is a very high-level, goal-oriented approach, and clearly that is important, but there are also associated other issues important, which we're putting into this new standard for good practice, the 220 standard. And we all know accessibility is important. It's very closely related to usability, defined in this ISO standard as usability for users with the widest range of capabilities. User experience brings in particularly users' emotional experience. And then I want to talk particularly today about being concerned with controlling unacceptable risks of undesirable consequences when you use systems. Now, we've coined we needed the term for this. Some of you may have heard of the ISO term quality in use. Well, this is even broader. Quality in use was usability and dealing with risks. Quality of use is a term we're currently planning to use to cover this wide range of issues, because clearly the word usability has been stretched about as far as it can be, and one does need a broader concept for all these user-related issues. Just to explain that a little bit more, this ISO approach to usability is based on starting with goals and really concentrating on the results you achieve. It's not about this is a sort of black box where there's an interaction going on, but the ISO standard says the important thing is that people are effective, efficient, and satisfied, whatever system you give them. So complete design freedom to produce an appropriate system. The criteria are looking for effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. And what we want to emphasize, a lot of the things we would like to emphasize in new standards echo some of the things that Gilbert was saying this morning. I completely agree that there is a problem that the way this is often interpreted is these are the goals for a usability test and these are the results the computer gives you at the end of the usability test. Well, that may be important, but really you can deal with goals at a higher level. So it shouldn't just be about programming the video recorder, it should be about achieving the user's goal, as Gilbert pointed out, which is to record a program. And there are a lot of different solutions to doing that. And we want to emphasize in the new standards to try and look at the high-level goals and not the low-level goals at the level of user interaction. So in addition to these high-level objectives, I think adding freedom from unacceptable risk is the most important addition. But in addition to that, as I said, we've got accessibility as usability for people with wide range of capabilities and disabilities. Learnability, I think, should be in there, because learnability you can interpret as the goal of learning to use a system. If you've not used it before, how effective will you be? Will you actually succeed in learning it? How efficient will you be? How long will it take you to learn it? And is it are you happy with the process you went through to have to learn to use the system? So that's very, very important for many of the systems we use today. And user experience is interesting because this framework we've got here was sort of a business-friendly framework to try and relate outputs which are relevant to usability to business objectives, because clearly from a business perspective, all of these are prerequisites for successful use of a system, very closely related to success of a system. I think what user experience is doing is sort of looking at this from the inside out. Rather than looking from the outside, it's saying what's going on in the user's head while they're going through this interaction, and can we learn something at this personal level of a single individual. These you tend to measure as an average across a group of people, and you have this sort of management statistic about the average success rate and the average time people take. User experience is particularly users' personal experience and emotional experience. At least that's my interpretation of what it's giving us. So, I'm preaching that it's meaningless to consider usability without also considering risk. And if you just sort of take a simple example, you could have a target. I've done this with clients. How successful do you expect your users to be in carrying out a particular task? I negotiate with them. They say, well, we'd be happy if 9 out of 10 people got this right first time. That may be the figure you put down as your requirement or figure, or what you're measuring in the usability test. But what about the other 10% that don't succeed? If they just try again and they've got a way around it, it doesn't really matter. But perhaps those other 10% of people will run into real serious problems as a consequence of not completing this task correctly. If that's the case, you'll be much more concerned about the risks for the 10% of people who don't complete the task correctly than you would be about the 90% who do succeed. And similarly, task time can be critical in the business environment. And what are the risks if the tasks take longer than you plan? And satisfaction clearly is critical, particularly in a web environment where people don't like offering on one website, they can go to another. So I think one of the important offerings of usability is to mitigate risk. Now, just to give a few examples, I do a lot of traveling using airline booking sites, and a few years ago I actually thought I'd made the right booking. It wasn't until I got the confirmation and looked at it, found I'd booked the wrong day. Now, I phoned up the airline and managed to talk my way into refund, which is quite difficult to do, but I got away with it. But that airline booking site hadn't gone through the process to reflect back to me the detail to make sure I'd checked it and knew it was correct before I actually went through the purchase process. You can design websites to minimize the chance that users make errors, and clearly an error of booking a flight can be a very expensive error. And then there's another example, and that was a problem to me. Of course, that one, it's a problem to me. I might lose my money. It's not a problem to the website. They gain money for somebody not traveling. But some problems are both a problem to the user and to the organization. And there is an example of a Sat-Nav system. Now, I need a new Sat-Nav for my car. Michelin are producing one. I use lists of Michelin restaurants. I thought, what a good idea. Maybe a Michelin Sat-Nav will help me find good Michelin restaurants. They were advertising this Sat-Nav on their site. I thought, but before I go ahead and purchase one, I'll look around and see if there are any reviews of it. And PC Magazine, very famous US magazine, had taken a look at this, and they said overall they were sorely disappointed. The menus were difficult to navigate, inefficiently laid out. To find a list of the nearest gas stations from the map took 10 screen taps. Some products can do this with a single tap, and the average about 4. I do trust my tyres to the Michelin man, but for entry-level GPS devices, there are others on the market that are better and easier to use. So very bad publicity for this system from its poor usability. It's clearly dangerous to the user driving along trying to find gas and having to half concentrate on tapping this thing 10 times, and the consequences, I'm sure, impacted on the potential sales of this. So it actually, usability problems were a financial problem for Michelin in selling these devices. And then other things at a more corporate level. I was talking to a new usability manager for a well-known multinational in Europe, and to promote their offerings, they were setting up a social media software. He joined the company while the development was halfway through, and said, could they show him the user requirements, the context of use of this thing, and have they done any usability testing? No, we've got a tight schedule, it's due to be released next month, everything's under control. The release date was a complete flop. It didn't provide the facilities their customers wanted, and it was very complex to use anyway, and they lost the whole investment. So a small amount of work on user-centered design can actually manage these risks. And this was also the case in the UK a few years ago when they produced new software for the people who issue passports. And it wasn't until they rolled this out over the weekend, the people who issue the passports came in on the Monday morning and suddenly found the process for issuing a passport was far more complex. It took them twice as long. And of course, it meant that there were huge queues. It took taking forever to get a passport. People were waiting months. They had to miss meetings and holidays. They were queuing all day to try and get a passport, all for the simple reason that nobody thought about user performance when they're designing this new system. A little bit of usability testing, they'd have identified this before they released the system. So there are many risks, and I think when you look at most systems, you can identify potential risks of what can happen when, if there's poor usability affecting effectiveness, efficiency or satisfaction, or indeed the other quality of use components. So, solution to this is to user-centered design, and this is the same process with a different diagram, that a simplified version of this, of the diagram that Gilbert showed this morning. and I think there's nothing magic about this. Most textbooks on user-centered design will have the same activities. And I would, however, commend this standard to you if you want a concise, simply explained explanation of how to do user-centered design at a high level. That's what this standard's aimed at for a management audience. So, 10 or 15 years ago, I was, as part of a European project, I was working with a couple of companies to help them improve their processes. And so we need to identify the methods which we recommended they use. And this was for a company currently did no usability work at all. And I said, well, here's some simple methods you should be using which would support these activities: planning, specifying, context of use, requirements, producing user-centered design solutions, and evaluating. And here are the things you should do. You should hold a stakeholder meeting right at the beginning to understand how usability can relate to your system. You should identify the context of use. You should define some scenarios of use, specify requirements for effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction, have some baselining of the existing system to see how you compare, do some prototyping, have some support from Style Guide, do evaluation both at the expert level and the user-based level, and finally, when you've released the system, collect feedback to see whether it's working as you expected it to work. And that's a good, simple way to implement user-centered design without using any complicated methods. And this worked very well. We implemented this in two organizations. One was the government department, which deals with tax in the UK. And, my bullets have turned into 4s. I knew if you don't use your computer, you get funny effects. Anyway, these 4 is not a number there, it's just a funny-shaped bullet. And anyway, the original symbol here were the ticks. These were the original slides supplied by the organizations I worked with, and they said significant improvement in all areas. They were strong in some areas. They need to improve in others. It was a step change in the awareness and practice of human-centered design in their organization. And the other organization we're working with, which was producing avionics software in Israel, very enthusiastic, positive feedback, definite improvement, cost-effective, relatively intuitive, although some tailoring required, and they were going to incorporate these 10 techniques into their standard development process. And they thought these could be used quite widely. So, a success story, but of course, these are sort of somewhat ad hoc, and furthermore, you don't, although that was promoted as simple, you don't always have the resources to even work at that level. So if 10 is too many, what do you do if you can't use all 10? And really, are these the right 10 methods anyway? And what about the other methods which are not in that list? So it's a good start. So next European project, UsabilityNet, we came up with a slightly more sophisticated approach, a few more methods. And on this approach, you could also say which methods are most appropriate when you have limited time or no direct access to users or limited skills and expertise to apply the methods. And this highlighted on this list of methods at the planning stage: requirements, design, implementation, test and measure, and post-release. Here are some methods most appropriate under the particular constraints you've identified at the top. So that was, but even then, it's still a rather ad hoc list of methods. And I've been doing some work with Javier Ferre in Madrid, and he came from a software engineering background and tried to understand how human-centered design, user-centered design could benefit the software engineering process. So he got all the textbooks at the time by the famous authors, and he identified 96 different categories of user-centered activity, 96. But if you look, the number each author mentioned was less than half. A third to a half of those were mentioned by each author. In other words, there was no consensus on what constitutes good practice. It's almost like a craft driven by the gurus who recommend their approach with their subset of all the things you could do. They're the ones, I suppose just like me previously, I was saying here are the ones I think you should use, here are the ones these authors, methods these authors think you can use. So it struck me we need a more principled approach. And this And I realized that what we should be doing is not what historically people have done, and saying, here's some methods, pick this one, pick another one. It is to say, what are we trying to achieve? These 96 different objectives that Javier Ferri identified are the types of things you can do during design to support achieving usability and quality of use. And another European project I was involved in, we got some funding to actually identify good practice in industry. So this is a very, very detailed description of the methods and techniques, or not methods and techniques, the basic activities that should be carried out to provide the information needed to support human-centered design through the development process, both at a management level to high level, and then in detail during your process. You've got the planning, the requirements, context of use, design solutions, and evaluating design against requirements. And under each of those headings is a list of the types of information and activity which could potentially be useful. So this provides a snapshot of good practice at the time this standard was produced. And the logic is then that what one needs to do is to find appropriate methods to implement the practice. And once you've decided, yes, this type of activity is useful, you've then probably got several methods. For example, if you want to identify information about users, there are a number of techniques you could use to find out about users. Interviews or surveys or speaking to managers. There are a number of techniques. One may be more appropriate than another. So what I've been doing is trying to put together what seems to me to be a complete account of the logical process that I believe, as a researcher and consultant, it's necessary to go through to adopt the most appropriate methods in your development process. And furthermore, I worked with Javier Ferri to produce some software which demonstrated that you could provide a tool to support people making these decisions. So there's really two messages here. One is this: I recommend this as a process which is appropriate for a mature organization to follow in deciding which methods to use. And also there's a tool which could be further developed to support that process in particular environments. Now, if this is visible, which I think I don't know if you can read it from the back. I maybe need to read this out. So this is the sequence which I recommend is followed, and this is in 3 parts. There's input information into the user-centered, human-centered process on the left. On the right, there are the decisions which the person carrying out the process needs to make, and in the center, there's the type of information that a tool can provide to simplify the decisions which the human has to make. So I'll run through this. So the first input is that you need to identify who are the success-critical stakeholders and what are their requirements and what are the risks if you don't meet the requirements of your critical stakeholders. Now, critical stakeholders is a Barry Beam concept from systems engineering. I think it's a very good one. You have lots of people who would like lots of things out of your system, including your users and management and investors and whatever. But which of those, what are the minimum you've got to deliver to satisfy each one? And some of those things will be nice to have rather than essential. So first of all, concentrate on the essential requirements, because those are the ones you've got to manage the risks if you don't reach them. You've got to be very aware right through development of any decisions you make, how that will influence reaching those critical objectives. And one can give some support in the tool to help people think about it, but clearly you need to understand you need knowledge of the product to understand what the requirements are to meet those success-critical stakeholder requirements, and what the potential risks are to each stakeholder. The next thing you need is a knowledge of the benefits that user-centered design could provide at each stage of the project to manage these risks. And the knowledge to support that is awareness of what these activities are at each stage, and that's the information in the ISO standard I mentioned, which is a catalogue of activities you can carry out at every stage of development. You need to say, where in development am I going to prioritize? Where am I strong? Where am I weak? And based on that, where do I want to concentrate my resources? Is this a new system, so I need to concentrate resources early on in understanding my users and my tasks and my environments? Or is this a new version of old systems I want to optimize, so I want to put more resources later on in evaluation and refining the system, for example? So having selected where in development you believe you need to focus your resources, the next thing is, as I said, the ISO standard provides you with information about the types of activity you could carry out. And furthermore, the types of methods, what you then want to know is what methods can I use to support these activities. And this is something we built into the tool, matching methods to activities. You can, having identified the methods, you then need to understand which methods are going to work in your particular environment. What constraints are you under? And you need to identify those constraints. And then, of course, you need to match the constraints about the methods. Given the constraints I'm under, like the ones I showed on the previous diagram, limited access to users or limited expertise, how does that influence a decision on which methods to use? And these is, of course, something which a usability professional will be doing from their professional expertise. What I'm trying to do here is to turn it into a principled activity. So having matched the constraints against the methods, you then get a subset of methods, prioritized methods, which are appropriate to support each activity you need to carry out. And I'll illustrate that with some shots from the tool. First of all, just to highlight this benefits and risks approach, which is so important, that they're sort of mirror images of one another. And I think in the past, people have concentrated on business benefits, and I've got a chapter in the book on cost benefits of usability. And clearly, all these human-centered design activities can improve usability and provide business benefits. The mirror image of that is they can also manage the risk. If you don't carry them out, there's an increased risk of poor system and increased risk to the success-critical stakeholders. And usability is sometimes discussed as a hygiene factor. You've got a minimum level. And for some aspects of usability, that's it. You get to a minimum level and you've done enough. Although it's often very difficult even to bring your usability up to a minimum level. Some aspects, particularly something like user experience or other design aspects of the product, you may get opportunities from having a system which is ahead of the others in the market, and therefore is particularly appreciated by users and gives you opportunities you wouldn't have if you just had a boring sort of minimum system with the minimum capability. So with all of that in mind, if you say I was involved in designing a Sat-Nav system, and I was aware of the problems that Michelin had with their system, so I thought, well, actually, the benchmarking or being aware of previous practice, it's absolutely essential to have a good understanding of all this background information on context of use and tasks, needs of the users, requirements of the users, and if I don't have that information, there's a high risk that it increases the risk to an unacceptable level that my system might fail. So the tool here is just trying to help people think of the types of risks they might face and where in the development process they should focus their attention to manage those risks. It's not automating anything, but it's really just prompting people to think about these issues. So in this case, the context of use seems to be the most important area to focus on. And having done that, then the tool expands the different activities you could carry out, and also provides you with some explanation from the ISO standard of all the activities that you could carry out at that stage. So for context of use, the ISO standards say the best practices include identifying and analysing the roles of each group of stakeholders likely to be affected by the system, describe the characteristics of the users, describe the cultural environment, organisational management regime, and so on. So that's a list of the activities identified as you potentially you may need to carry out if you're dealing with context of use. So having identified, here's the area I need to focus my attention on, you then identify the constraints you're under. Now this list of constraints was extracted from yet another ISO standard with a few extra constraints added in blue. And indeed, this list is probably not complete. There may be other constraints which are relevant in your situation, which are peculiar to you, which would influence how you select methods. But it is dealing with a wide range of the typical issues which would influence which method would be appropriate for you. Project constraints about the resources you've got in the project, constraints about users, what type of users do you have and how much access you've got to users during development, constraints about the complexity and the type of task the user's going to be carrying out, whether efficiency and accuracy is important in this task, and how well the product's understood. Is customization important? Is this a general purpose product or a very specific product? And clearly there are methods peculiar to certain domains, so one also ought to, and that was a suggested categorization. Probably that categorization could be extended. So having, to actually help people think about this, what the tool does is it lists the constraints and people select the constraints that are appropriate. And rather like that simple usability net version I showed you where you tick the boxes, here, and it coloured, it then highlighted the methods which are appropriate. Here, as you tick the boxes, the list of potential methods changes with the most appropriate ones at the top. So you can explore how you can optimize your methods given certain constraints. If you have no access to users, this, how does that limit you and change the methods which would be most appropriate? In addition, since I also was responsible for putting together the usability body of knowledge for the UPA, we link these things. People want to, if some of these methods are ones you don't recognize or you're not quite sure what they are, you can click on the method and that will take you to the usability body of knowledge, which for a lot of these methods has quite a detailed explanation, in this case competitor analysis, what it is, how you do it, and some links to more information if you would like to follow up in more detail, or if you're considering doing competitor analysis, not done it before. So this isn't going to make anybody into an expert, but it's going to be an aid to people who are exploring using methods and techniques that they may have heard of but not tried themselves before. So the output of going right through this process is that you come up at the end of the process with prioritized results. And these results, it's a summary of the screen we saw before, prioritizing. But in this case, you may have planned, you can either do this planning on an ad hoc basis, just at one stage of development, or plan if you were planning at the beginning of a project and trying to see how you would prioritize work across the different stages of the project. You would then get a suggested set of lists for each project stage with some information attached about the importance you'd given to that earlier on based on your assessment of the extent to which those methods and techniques would control your risk. So I put this forward as a model of good practice. One thing that's not in which is in the sequence but is not in the tool, is that, of course, what you end up with, and I'm calling a method, as Gilbert rightly said, these are sort of method categories, and you've got to operationalize each method. And I do believe you could take the same approach of constraints to help people decide how to operationalize. So if your conclusion was, I need to do some user-based testing, there are lots of criteria that I, as somebody who have done a lot of user-based testing, use when I'm recommending to a client, this is how many users we should use, and should we concentrate on finding the problems or getting measures, how should we select the tasks, and should these be predefined tasks, or should the users choose their own tasks? There are lots of decisions one needs to make, and those are all based on the priorities for the information you need to obtain from user-based testing, and the constraints you're under in terms of how long you've got and how easy it is to recruit users. Many things which again could be listed in a tool like this, specifically designed to aid people in making decisions about optimizing the way they actually tailor a method to the specific situation they're in. So that's a logical extension to this process. So this tool is available on the web for anybody who'd like to see it. It is, I call it a demonstrator. It gives very plausible results, but it's not it's not been robustly tested in industry. The code is available for anybody who'd like to take this tool further for research and development. I think it's a useful, and Javier Ferrer uses this tool as part of his, to support his classes when he's training software engineers in applying user-centered design, for example. And I think it's a help to anybody who wants to get a slightly broader view of the possibility of carrying out user-centered design in a way which is more tailored to specific situations rather than just being a cookbook way of doing the same thing every time. So I will be talking about this in more detail and precisely how one could do this and the relationship, and particularly the relationship of risks to method selection in the workshop tomorrow, if anybody would like to hear about this in more detail. And I'm aware that since this tool was developed, we've developed, it was since then that we came up with the importance of quality of use as a broader objective in usability. The current approach documented around this tool is rather usability-oriented, usability and freedom from risk, and perhaps a little bit of learnability. It should have, and it could easily be extended in principle to deal with, also with accessibility and user experience. So it's exactly the same principle, it's just the scope of the issues. And indeed, I guess the way to do that would be the current tool and approach is based on the old ISO standard from the 1990s. New ISO standard for quality of use would be the appropriate database and, on which one would base these decisions from a broader perspective. Just as an aside, I've been talking about user experience in the way it's grown up in the research field, and indeed ISO adopted the definition from the research field, user experience as being the individual experience of the user, and particularly the emotional experience. As we know, industry has also adopted this phrase, but it's sort of in rather a different meaning, and I think it's really, the way it's used in industry is much closer to what I'm calling quality of use. It's a whole range of issues associated with use for system. So we have a big terminology conflict there. And when I review papers and somebody says user experience, I really don't know what they're referring to. Are they looking at it from a research experience or industry, where user experience is just a rather general term for all the issues associated with users. And I'm here today as the director, the UXPA regional director for Europe, and you may know UPA has also gone through this. It's changed its name from usability to user experience, and this of course is the broad meaning of user experience. And it was the UXPA which produced the usability body of knowledge, and I hope there may be some interest here in Estonia, either in a local chapter of the UXPA, or UXPA has recently produced new membership rates which are particularly inexpensive, for example, in this region. So people might be interested in looking at the benefits of the UXPA to them, or thinking about setting up a local chapter in this area, which I'd be very happy to assist with. And then Estonia or the Baltics could add its chapter to complement all these other existing UXPA chapters. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Nigel. And possibility for questions. There is one microphone here, another one here. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand and we'll try to direct a microphone towards you. On my own side, I was looking at the tool on the website. So the website is the tool, I understand, the usability planner.org.
Yeah.
I went through that and I found that I come at the methods that possibly were fit for my restrictions, and then I felt I was needing to have links out from that. So if there is a description of a method, so in case I'm somebody who has been using all of the methods day in, day out, then it's probably not an issue. But when I'm new on the field, and you probably want to enlarge in the field, then actually it would be very good in my mind to have the pointers and to the lessons, how to actually learn to use the methodology better, because as I recall from last year's Ago Boiko's presentation about eye tracking questions, that when the methodologies get used in the marketing, they usually get watered down. And so giving a toolbox to find the methodologies, I think, should continue with teaching how to use them properly and how to see behind them. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, and this approach has been criticized in that it can't turn somebody without expertise into an expert. So I think I just see this as an aid to broaden people's objectives, maybe to make them take more seriously the possibility of using some methods which would actually benefit them that they've never really thought of using before. So I think it's for people who are either starting out in the subject or trying to broaden their expertise, and maybe motivating them to go a little bit further. And maybe having decided they want to do something, I think, well, and now I need to involve somebody who's done this before to get some real personal experience and learn how to do this. So I think it's, I don't know, it depends whether you're fully confident that you're doing the right thing, or whether you would like to test your view of, you might say, well, this is the way the methods I always use in this situation. I wonder what this tool recommends. Maybe there's some other ways of doing it.
Yeah, I personally like to always see behind the methods there. Okay, any questions from the audience side? There is one.
The question from the microphone guy. So I would like to explore this idea which you discussed about user experience, and then you also introduced the term of quality of use. So you also suggested that there's a kind of confusion between academia and industry of what the term should mean, and also we know examples of, let's say, that in some products where the user experience, so to say, is kind of higher in terms of the, I don't know, the thing being playful or visually appealing or pleasurable to use, then people kind of tend to maybe actually be more forgiving to usability concerns. So how do you feel that should be addressed, and whether the term should be maybe like some sort of agreed upon definition should be provided, or maybe there should even be a standard, an ISO standard user experience. So what would your ideas be on that?
Well, that's a very good point, because if from a research perspective, and the way I was using it here, I'm saying it's very important to consider the importance of from the user's emotional experience and their engagement, and see if that's relevant to your product or system. And of course, if we lose the word user experience to this more general use, how do we differentiate between the very general user experience and the very specific experience? And of course, then people very difficult to communicate and explain and justify. If when you say user experience, you mean something totally different. don't think it really helps, but I like the phrase user's experience, because I think that sounds a little bit more precise, but maybe that's a challenge. Is there another term which is not too... I don't think we want to invent something completely different, but is there something which would clarify this? I don't know. Yeah, maybe somebody's got a creative solution to that.
But do you feel, for example, the usability standard should be updated and expanded to be a user experience standard, for example? So there's an agreed upon document.
Well, if it was my way, I would reissue this standard as a user experience standard, or quality of use standard, whatever you call it. But there's a little bit of this, tension, because we've got vested interests in people who want usability explained. So one of the challenges in redoing the usability standard is to try to position usability as a component of quality of use, saying the real issue is quality of use, and this standard tells you how to address usability as part of quality of use. And indeed, as I said, the other standard on processes is everything you need to do to achieve quality of use, and that model of quality of use can be used. It's being used in Germany to accredit, to provide accreditation for usability professionals in Germany against this set of good activities and techniques which a usability professional should know how to do. So they have a test examination where you're tested in all of these. You can use it as a syllabus for a course. Again, because it's a reference model of good practice. So I think that we're on there. We are redoing it in the broad. So I think it's when you try to, when we extract that down to little components, then we've got the terminology problem for what each component means.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other microphone requests? No? Then...
Well, I may just say, if anybody's interested in research in the area, I'm very happy to take this tool forward in another direction if they'd find it useful, either as a research base or even as something, say, more commercial, more practically applied.
Okay. So, thank you, Nigel.